This is APUSH in a Rush
on chapters 12 and 13.
I'm Lily.
I'm Amy.
I'm Maria.
In the early to mid-1800s, the reform movement was rapidly increasing in popularity. People began to focus on a universal goal: reorganize society on the basis of cooperation rather than competitive individualism. Inspired by the Second Great Awakening, reformers focused on issues like peace, temperance, women's rights, education, and anti-slavery. Some reformers took their ideals seriously enough to form perfect societies called utopian communities in which social harmony would be restored and things like marriage relations would be altered. On the other hand, those who opposed reform, like Catholics, did so because of differing views on freedom. Asylums also saw their origins during this time period. The goal of turning all members of society into moral citizens caused the implementation of institution buildings, prisons, insane asylums, and orphanages. State school system began at the forefront of educational reform. These state schools, paid for by tax dollars, would allow all wealth classes to have access to education. However, these advances took place largely in the North, as the South remained slavery-centered and closed off to such ideas. It was obvious how starkly different the goals of the North and South were, and this eventually led to the Civil War. On the topic of slavery, Americans differed in opinion. Many believed colonization, abolishing slavery, but moving Black Americans to Africa was the only solution. Liberia in Africa was established for this purpose, and while a large number of Black Americans did move there, the majority disagreed with colonization. They wanted freedom and access to actual American rights. Groups that fell under militant abolitionism demanded abolition immediately, not in the future, as many slavery debates of the past had focused on. Abolitionists rejected violence as a method for advancing their fight. The abolitionists faced opposition from Southern men who attempted to disrupt abolitionist meetings and deter them from continuing their protest of slavery. Although it may not seem connected to the issue of slavery, the feminist movement arose due to the increased awareness of the issues brought up by the abolitionists. Equal rights, suffrage, and universal freedom were shared goals between the two groups. Leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott began their reform careers as abolitionists and went on to become influential feminists, organizing the Seneca Falls Convention. The convention drew attention to women's rights and brought up the idea of women's suffrage for the first time. It was a turning point in the feminist movement.
Abolitionists and feminists wanted true American rights, those that were promised to them in the Constitution.
The Liberty Party was founded with the hopes to make abolitionism a political party. Manifest Destiny. Slavery moved to the center stage of American politics because of Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny's belief that God intended the American nation to reach all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The territorial expansion was to Oregon, California, and Utah, which was all part of Mexico. The spirit of Manifest Destiny gave way to ideas about racial superiority. Territorial expansion was seen as proof of the innate superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. The Mexican frontier. Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, and the northern frontier of Mexico was California, New Mexico, and Texas. In 1821, California's non-Indian population was vastly outnumbered. It turned into the Californios, the Gente de Razon, versus the Indios, the Gente Sin Razon. There was the Texas Revolt. American settlers demanded greater autonomy within Mexico. Mexico had abolished slavery, but American settlers brought slaves with them. Mexico's ruler, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, sent an army in 1835 to impose central authority. There was the Battle of the Alamo and Sam Houston, who called for Texas independence. The Mexican-American War. In April 1846, conflict was inevitable in the disputed border region between the Nueces River and Rio Grande. After fighting broke out, Polk called for a declaration of war. The bulk of the fighting occurred in central Mexico, and Abraham Lincoln was a huge critic of the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in February of 1848 and confirmed the annexation of Texas, ceded California and present-day New Mexico. The California Gold Rush. In January of 1848, gold was discovered in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The gold rush population was very diverse, and underground mining, which required a large investment in capital, was required after surface mines were exhausted. This worsened the conflicts among California's mainly racial and ethnic groups. For California's Indians, the gold rush and absorption into the United States was disastrous. The Wilmot Proviso. This was a proposal to prohibit slavery from all the territory required from Mexico. This issue divided the nation according to section, as Northerners supported it and nearly all Southerners opposed it. It passed in the House but not in the Senate. The Free Soil Party. In 1848, opponents of slavery's expansion organized the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party called for the parting of slavery from Western territories and for the federal government to provide free homesteads to settlers in new territories. The idea of free soil appeared to the widespread racism in the North, as they wanted to stop the competition with slave labor. A compromise of 1850. In 1850, California asked to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Senator Henry Clay offered a plan with 4 main provisions. California would enter the Union as a free state, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished in Washington, D.C., and a new stringent law would allow Southerners to reclaim runaway slaves. The status of slavery and the remaining territories acquired by Mexico would be left to the decision of local white inhabitants, and the U.S. would agree to pay up the massive debt that Texas had accumulated while being independent.
To further controversy over slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act was introduced in 1850, which allowed special federal commissioners to determine the fate of alleged fugitives without benefit of jury or trial or testimony by the accused individual. Also at this time, Douglas introduces popular sovereignty. The status of slavery would be determined by the votes of local settlers rather than Congress, and Douglas introduced this as a middle ground between the North and the South. While the Missouri Compromise was made as a balance between slave states and free states, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the Missouri Compromise and created 2 new territories, allowing popular sovereignty, which shattered the Democratic Party. This led to Bleeding Kansas, which was guerrilla warfare between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces, which discredits Douglas' popular sovereignty and also aids the Republicans. Another cause of division at this time was the Know-Nothing Party. These were nativists, meaning they were hostile to immigrants, especially Catholics, mostly Irish and German, and this appealed to those who were anti-Catholic, anti-slavery, and anti-liquor. Another controversy was the idea of free labor versus slave labor, as free labor could not compete with slave labor, and so slavery's expansion had to be halted to ensure freedom for the white laborer. One of the most infamous Supreme Court rulings was announced in 1857. This was the Dred Scott decision. In the case of Dred Scott versus Stanford, Scott sues for his freedom after being in free state territories. The court ruled that only white persons can be citizens of the U.S. and that blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that Congress had no power to restrict slavery. In 1860, the Democratic Party splits with its nomination of Douglas in 1860 and the Southern Democrats' nomination of John Breckinridge, who insisted slavery must be protected in Western territories. Neither Northern nor Summer Democrats were willing to reconcile, and the party splits. Lincoln, little known outside of Illinois, re-enters politics after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He was against slavery, but willing to compromise with the South to preserve the Union. His devotion to the Union appealed to moderate Republicans, and his emphasis on the moral dimension of sectional controversy made him acceptable to Republicans with abolitionist backgrounds. Without a single vote from the South, Lincoln wins the 1860 election. In the months that followed Lincoln's election, 7 states, stretching from South Carolina to Texas, seceded from the Union. President Buchanan denied that a state could secede, but insisted federal government could not use any force against it. Lincoln opposed the Crittenden Plan, which guaranteed the future of slavery in the states would exist, and also extended the Missouri Compromise to the line of the Pacific Ocean. The 7 seceding states formed the Confederate States of America, formed a constitution, and elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their president. When Lincoln became president, 8 slave states remained in the Union, and Lincoln rejected secession but also denied any intention of interfering with the slavery in the states. At Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the South fires the first shot, beginning the Civil War as Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to suppress the insurrection.
Thanks for watching!